So in my search for good horror games for the PS2, I've ended up trying a number of games that, for one reason or another, I didn't really feel like doing full reviews for, but I still wanted to give my 2 cents on them, which is what this video is for. Here I'll take a quick look at 8 horror games for the PS2, and offer my thoughts on each. First up we have Clock Tower 3. I did try some of the older Clock Tower games, but the indirect cursor system rubbed me the wrong way, so I couldn't get into them. Thankfully Clock Tower 3 has a more sensible control scheme, and is a decent enough horror game, though it doesn't start off the best. You play Alyssa, a teenage girl at a boarding school who receives a letter from her mother, warning her that her life may be in danger, and that she should go into hiding until her 15th birthday has passed. Being a level-headed, rational thinker, she of course immediately ignores this advice and goes home to make sure her mother is okay. When she arrives home, she encounters a very suspicious-looking man who more or less says that her mother isn't coming back, and makes some very creepy advances on her before walking away while laughing. And instead of running off and calling the police, she instead stays in the house to try to look for her mother. Yeah, I understand that human beings don't always behave rationally, but when someone acts this stupid, it becomes hard to sympathize with them. The opening of the game does a good job of building intrigue, but it would have been better if it hadn't made the main character look like such an idiot. Personally, I think they should have omitted the first letter from her mother entirely, and just had her return home because she was worried about her. And they should have made the guy she runs into creepy, but not so obviously creepy that any sane person would call the police. As she explores the house, she obtains a flask of holy water, as well as another letter from her mother explaining a little bit of what's going on. Alyssa then ends up running through a doorway, and winds up in the 1940s when the air raids are going on in London. What? So she's traveling through time to help restless spirits find peace or something? The story is all kinds of bizarre and confusing. What saves it is the gameplay flow and overall atmosphere. Like in Haunting Ground, you deal with a series of stalkers that you must run and hide from throughout each section of the game. But overall I would say that the game paces the stalker encounters a little better than Haunting Ground, so the gameplay aspect is slightly better. But when it comes to everything else, from the graphics, presentation, atmosphere, story, characters, and music, Clock Tower 3 is worse than Haunting Ground. And by worse I don't mean bad, just not as good. So I would recommend trying Haunting Ground first. If you love Haunting Ground and want to play another game very similar to it, then Clock Tower 3 is worth a look. But if you didn't like Haunting Ground, you can safely skip Clock Tower 3. Next is Cold Fear, a game that was apparently trying to be an action horror game to compete with Resident Evil 4. And boy does it fail. It's obvious that the game spent a lot of time and effort into having really nice graphics and presentation, and for the time I'm sure the visuals were quite impressive, but they spent much less time trying to make sure that the story and gameplay were engaging. And since having the best graphics is an ever-moving goalpost, the now nice but dated visuals can't distract from the fact that the story is pretty banal, and the gameplay is competent but rather clunky and unremarkable. Resident Evil 4 obviously also put a fair amount of effort into looking nice, but while the graphics are a bit dated by modern standards, it still holds up because it's a well-designed and incredibly fun game. Cold Fear is not, and so is not worth remembering or returning to. Curse, the Eye of Isis. In this game, you take control of Darian, the son of an archaeologist who goes to a museum in order to meet up with a friend, and ends up being caught up in a mysterious and ancient curse, and must figure out what happened to his father and how to prevent himself from meeting the same fate. It has a very Indiana Jones feel to it, but the horror twists help it stand out. It didn't really grab me, but it seems like a decent enough horror game, and I would recommend checking it out. Extermination. Here's another game that is also trying to go for the action horror thing that Resident Evil 4 nailed so well. But Extermination gets more leeway than Cold Fear for 2 reasons. First of all, it came out several years before Resident Evil 4, and secondly, it's basically alright. It's most definitely not as good as Resident Evil 4, but it has good pacing, a decent atmosphere, and the gameplay is pretty fun. It's not a great game, but it's good, and worth a look if you like this sort of thing. The next game is Glass Rose. It has an intriguing premise. You play as a Japanese man, and you and your girlfriend decide to go to an abandoned mansion to explore when she suddenly vanishes, and soon you vanish as well, only to wake up in the same mansion and find that you've somehow gone back in time. You must try to rescue your girlfriend and escape the mansion, and along the way you piece together what happened there. As I said, the premise is good, but there's 2 things that killed it for me. First of all, the voice acting is really bad. And what's even more distracting is that they don't even attempt to have what the characters are saying sync up with the lip movements, and it's really distracting. I understand localizing can be hard, and we're not expecting it to be perfect, but we do expect them to at least try. Not here though. And the other thing that killed it for me was the gameplay, as it has the same cursor system as the older Clock Tower games that I really don't care for. Kuen. I think that's how you pronounce it. This game is by From Software. Most people know them for Dark Souls and the like, but they did make a lot of games before that, and not all of them were very good. Well, Kuen has managed to be a step up. It's basically a horror game with RPG elements where you must investigate an old manor where something has gone horribly wrong. You have the option of playing as one of two characters, and I would recommend starting as the one on the right, as that route does a much better job of explaining how the game mechanics work. The gameplay is okay, and it has a fairly good atmosphere, but I just couldn't get into it. The story is a little messy, and honestly the stuff going on is so horrific that it ends up being a little silly. Kuen is a decent horror game, but I couldn't get into it, and unless you like horror games, it's not something you need to run out and play right now. Manhunt. Now this game is interesting, as it caused a bit of controversy when it first came out. In Manhunt, you are an inmate on death row who gets roped into being a part of a snuff film that's being directed by an unseen man who seems way too into it. The premise of the snuff film is simple. You are locked into an enclosed area with a bunch of goons. Your objective is to kill the goons, and their objective is to kill you. The goons are normally stronger than you, and have friends to back them up, so stealth is the main method of disposing of them. It's kind of like the Hunger Games, except instead of 20 or so people trying to kill each other, it's 20 or so people ganging up to try to kill one person, namely you. And if you're spotted, you can be killed very quickly, especially if more than one of them spots you. Fortunately for you, they aren't too bright, and apparently they all have terrible eyesight. The game doesn't sound like it would be too controversial, except that the way you end up killing the goons is almost always incredibly brutal. The variety of weapons you can use to dispose of them ranges from glass shards, empty bottles, plastic bags, wires, bricks, knives, nail guns, which I honestly wouldn't recommend using, baseball bats, crowbars, and more. The game is clearly going for shock value, but because it's actually well designed and fun, it works. It's uncomfortable, but that's kind of the point. Getting mad at Manhunt for being shocking would be like getting mad at porn for showing naked people. That's the whole point of the experience. It's definitely not for everyone, and the game does get a touch repetitive after a while, but I do recommend it, both as a stealth game and as a horror game. It's effective as a horror game partly because you're alone in a dangerous environment, but also because it touches on uncomfortable issues. Technically everything you do in the game is self-defense, but at what point do you cross a line? A lot of the people you kill are clearly bad people, but does that make what you're doing right? This game isn't for the squeamish, but it's worth checking out. And finally we have Siren, or Forbidden Siren as it was also known. Honestly, I didn't get very far into the game. It has some good ideas, and one very interesting mechanic in particular, namely the ability to sightjack and see things from the perspective of the enemies in the level. It's a cool concept, just a shame that the game is paced erratically and that the gameplay feels rather clumsy. Plus, I've heard that there's a later game in the series that's a lot better, so I'll probably just play that instead at some point. So that's it for the PS2 Horror Roundup. Next time I'll be taking a more in-depth look at another horror game that is quite a bit better than anything covered here. See you then.